It's great to be joined today by Will MacAskill, who is an associate professor of philosophy at Oxford University, one of the progenitors of the social movement of effective altruism, which encourages the use of evidence and reason to do as much good as possible. Will, it's so great to have you on today. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's a pleasure.
So let's see. Let's maybe start with why would we even need a movement that wants to focus altruism effectively? In other words, what is often ineffective about altruism and the social movements that are inspired by it that would sort of cause us to say, hey, we should really think about how to be most effective in our altruism?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of people who are really trying to do good and are really well intentioned there. But unfortunately, the world's so complex that good intentions often aren't good enough. And there are many projects that people undertake that not just, like often they're just squandering kind of most of their resources, or even can actually end up doing harm as well. And so that's why it's crucial when we're thinking about all the different problems we could be facing, all the different things we could be doing, folk trying to think not just what does a little bit of good, but what does the most good possible.
Yeah, one example I've discussed with my audience when it comes to the world of sort of international aid is that there will many times be this phenomena where you will have a Western company that produces some kind of product who will decide that they're going to give a whole bunch of those products to an impoverished population in the developing world. Shoes would be an example, or
Yeah.
whatever the case may be. And that has obviously a positive short-term effect. People need shoes. People are better able to go to work if they have shoes. But it doesn't really do anything to address the fact that for the long-term sustainability of that population, you're really going to need to have sort of like a local shoe industry. And in fact, you may be hurting that in the long term by giving everybody free shoes. Is that the type of concern that you're dealing with? Is it just one among many? Or tell us about some of the other kind of maybe misplaced forms of altruism.
Yeah, I mean, giving of shoes is a great example. In fact, we often think of just the charity Give Directly as a kind of base standard by which to compare other altruistic activities, where Give Directly simply transfers cash to the poorest people in the world, saying, well, you know best about how to spend money to help yourselves. We've got to have a really high bar for thinking, we know better than you about what's most important in your lives. But yeah, unfortunately, international development and do-gooding more generally just has the history of many, often quite amusingly failed projects to try and help. So one example I like to use is the play pump, which is this children's merry-go-round that would double as a water pump. So children would play in this merry-go-round, and using the force of their play, they would pump clean water up to a tank that would provide the needs for the village. And this got tons of awards at the time. It won the World Bank Development Award. It was lauded in the press. But it was a terrible idea. I mean, aside from health and safety, so kids would sometimes fall off and break limbs, sometimes vomit from the spinning. It was also just not a very good pump. So unlike a normal merry-go-round that spins freely once you pushed it, this would require constant torque to pump up the water. And so kids would get very tired. They wouldn't want to play on this thing all day. And so it would be left up to the mothers or grandmothers of the village to push this brightly colored play pump round and round, a task they'd often find humiliating. And what's more, the kind of real kicker is just that this pumped far less water than the very boring but very functional Zimbabwe hand pump that these pumps sometimes replaced. And yet it pumped less water for 3 times the cost. And so despite, seeming like this amazing, exciting invention, it just wasn't really what people actually needed. It wasn't the best way of helping people. And stories like this are just all too common.
In doing good better, you sort of lay out some of the underlying principles of effective altruism. And if we were to sort of start to develop not necessarily a guide, but maybe at least sort of like a framework for thinking about how we can have the greatest impact, how important is the concept of deal with the worst first? In other words, the idea of finding the most dire problem that we can solve and trying to make improvements there. Is that an important concept, or is that one that maybe can be a distraction from figuring out the best way to do good?
Great. I think it's an important concept, but crucially, it's only one part of the truth. So we like to focus on problems that are very important, that is like very great in scale. That's the kind of direness you're talking about. But then also that are particularly tractable and also that are particularly neglected. So a problem might be really great in scale, but just very hard to fix. So the fact that we all die, aging, huge problem, kills 100 million people a year, but maybe not the most important thing to focus on right now, just because, well, such a hard problem to solve scientifically. And then neglectedness is perhaps the most unintuitive of these criteria, where it could be the case that a problem is very great in scale, and there's actually plenty of stuff you can do about it, but just there's already a lot of attention being devoted to it. And I give the example of kind of disaster relief in this category. Obviously, providing funding after the disaster is, it's hugely important, and there often are like many very good things you can do about it, though perhaps harder than some other areas. But disaster relief funding, it just gets a lot of funding compared to what I would call ongoing natural disasters like malaria, tuberculosis, HIV/AIDS. And that means that on the margin, with the additional funding that you use, it's not as effective as something which might be in the news less and therefore get less attention.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the news at the very tail end there. A lot of this does seem to be media driven in the sense that the ongoing crisis of all the kids, to use a stereotypical example, all the kids
Yeah.
dying of hunger in Africa compared to an acute weather event, for example, in the United States that kills a dozen people or 2 dozen people, and the sort of imbalance of media coverage relative to the harm that is done, that seems to significantly influence how people choose to either spend their time volunteering or make donations, does it not?
Yeah, this is absolutely huge. And that means why, people will want to focus on something like disaster relief rather than, say, deworming, which is one of our champion causes, where, it just doesn't make the news, at least not until recently, that about 1 billion people worldwide have intestinal worms in their guts. And this is probably the least sexy cause area you could imagine. And it doesn't kill as many people as other diseases, so it gets less attention. But it's phenomenally cheap to treat. You can cure children of intestinal worms for less than 50 cents per person. And that there's at least some evidence for thinking that that has long-lasting economic and educational impacts for those children, which is huge.
It seems that a lot of this is related to this idea that one person who dies is a tragedy which we all can sort of connect with in the specific sense, but a statistic of 10,000 people dying doesn't necessarily resonate with people in a sort of coherent narrative sense. And in that way, you could reduce, imagine, for example, that the number of kids dying from hunger in Africa is 10,000 a day, a week, whatever number it is.
Yeah, yeah.
If you reduce that to 8,000, you've just saved 2,000 people, but it's still not an incredible
Still
news
a huge,
story,
yeah.
right? Because now the news story is only 8,000 died. Whether if we find housing for the victims of a hurricane and we see their faces and we know their names, that's incredibly powerful in a sense.
Yeah, so I mean, humans are just evolved to identify and empathize with individuals, whereas when numbers get so large, it overwhelms us. So we do often see these, campaigns that can raise hundreds of thousands of dollars because one person, maybe one child, has some debilitating condition that needs a large amount of money. And obviously, it's great that people, reach out for their wallets to try and fund that. But at the same time, that amount of money could save the lives of 100 children elsewhere whose plight is less salient to us. And what effective altruism is about is trying to just, step back, accept that that emotional impulse, that empathy, is what's going to drive us, but then trying to use our ability to think and to reason to then guide that to wherever our efforts will have the biggest impact in terms of improving people's lives.
For people who are doing the majority of their altruism by donating to charities and nonprofits, what is the infrastructure you propose for evaluating where to donate? And in that sense, I'll throw out a few things. Obviously, the subject matter of the nonprofit is important to many people, and many times people are making contributions to nonprofits that are working on something that they're personally connected to. But from the point of view of, for example, looking at the percentage of donated funds that get to the beneficiaries as opposed to being tied up in administrative costs, is that type of analysis the type that the average person should be doing to figure out where to donate, or do you propose a different infrastructure?
Yeah, so the metric of how much is spent on overheads versus programs, I just don't think is very helpful at all.
Interesting.
Because you could have a really a really dumb program, one like the play pump, for example, and maybe it had very very low overheads, had only 1% overheads. But if you've got 1% overheads on what's not a very good program, you're still just not going to be a very good charity. In contrast, perhaps you spend 30% doing research, monitoring and evaluation, identifying the very best places to help. And then you're funding something like deworming, where you're having this huge impact, perhaps 100 times more, 1,000 times more, even than typical ways of doing good. Well, if you're getting 100x on some other charity, taking 30% off of that, even though I would say that 30% is necessary in the first place, well, that doesn't, you're still doing this far, far more good than if you've been focusing on a kind of lesser program. And so for individuals, what I'd recommend actually is, in general, just trying to follow advice and recommendations of kind of experts that we've tried to build up this infrastructure. So just in the same way as if you were investing your money, you wouldn't, best advice is not to do it yourself. Instead, maybe go with an index fund or go with good financial advice. We have a bunch of experts who, in total have spent tens of thousands of hours trying to work out what charities do the most good. And within the area of global health and development that we've talked about the most, GiveWell is the charity that really produces outstanding research on this topic. And if you go with their recommendations, you can save a life for just a few $1,000s. If you're interested in other cause areas, at effectivealtruism.org, we have a set of funds that focus on either global health and development or animal welfare or on the long run future. So rather than trying to help people today, trying to ensure that human civilization goes as well as possible for the centuries to come. And there you can donate to this fund that then experts will redistribute to the places that they think are going to have the biggest impact.
Absolutely fascinating stuff. We're going to link to a lot of those organizations in the description for the YouTube video for the interview. We've been speaking with Will MacAskill, who's an associate professor of philosophy at Oxford University. Will, so great to talk to you. I really do appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me on.